for the time to be zeroed in. Good evening. I'm very grateful for this invitation to talk to this forum. It is an academic privilege, and a vote of gratitude for the organizers for having enabled me to do so. I'd like to talk about the future challenges in the Israeli art of deterrence. And I'm going to talk about three main issues. I'm going to talk about a very traditional paradigm, and then the paradigmatic shift that has happened over the last decades, and I will conclude with a number of observations, in other words, food for thought, vis-a-vis the future challenges, vis-a-vis deterrence in Israel. Okay, as it was said by the previous speakers, what actually perhaps molded our approach were provided by our forefathers when we were thinking of the triangle of this security, as Major General Naveh and Brigadier General Dekel said. There was an integrative connection between the idea of deterrence and the warning. In other words, you needed two results. On one side, we look at a systemic deterrence that would give a solution to an operative problem that we were dealing with. The deterrence needed to be reloaded of those batteries of deterrence that were already being worked with. And the equations seemed to be quite simple. The more as our decisive was easier to attain, was difficult to attain, then you needed stronger issues of deterrence. When the function of the IDF in the battlefield was less impressive, then there was a kind of corrosion and a kind of even collapse of the deterrence side of things. And this continued until the 70s or 80s. Then in the 70s or 80s, as it was said, then we suddenly had a kind of know-how crisis. And we needed to internalize two problems. In other words, it wasn't necessarily a causal sort of tie between that and what actually happened in the field from the point of view of deterrence. For example, the war of attrition and the Yom Kippur War broke out after the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War actually showed how these things were working. And there was also an intuitive feeling that things moved from the conventional issues to different levels. In other words, before the nature of the change in the characteristics of the actual fighting, we suddenly felt a tremendous change. Suddenly, Israel were looking for something instead of what we would call a decisive campaign. And because of these alternatives that were found, they coined two terms and were mentioned here. And so there was a campaign between the wars, one of them, and various kind of other kinds of interim campaigns that were going on. And we needed somehow to rehabilitate this decisiveness, or to have a campaign between the various deterrence campaigns that were created by limited force being users, so that we would create a more realistic military sort of presence, but prevent the other side being sort of equipping themselves, getting ready for attacking us. And when the other side was still trying to subversively attack us, then we would have to develop things that were stronger from the point of view of the deterrence. And if you're thinking about all this kind of security concept, that in a way the investment in both the actual active and passive offense sort of forces, then we could achieve things in a better way. I think that I've tried to re-illustrate my way of thinking in the philosophy that really accompany us from the 40s till now. But the paradigmatic change that have changed, what conclusions can one learn from all this because of the future challenges that lie ahead? I think it's pretty obvious that deterrence is not something that is a standalone, but it is integrally connected to other components of our security approach. For example, deterrence does not solve strategic issues. That also one must have to think about. All it can do is to gain time before the next round. And one can also only deter when the other side has something to lose, because if they've got nothing to lose and they are humiliated, then we won't be able to deter him. And also, deterrence, from that we've learned from the last decade, is not an absolute term. It's not a generic term that you either have or don't have. It's multidimensional, and it has various dimensions against the same player, and you can create a balance where, to a certain degree, you can either deter them from certain steps or not deter them. For example, you can't deter them from the actual arming themselves. And in this spectrum of players, with each player, we've got to tailor-make a real kind of deterrent that would be adapted to their strategic thinking and their kind and what exactly they want to achieve. So up to now, it's been tailor-made for hybrid players, but can we take this kind of world views and these perceptual views and actually apply them on Syria or Iran, for example, or players who are starting to fill out the sort of peripheral areas around us? Or how can you do it, for example, and tailor-make it when you're fighting against cyber terrorism and cyber attacks, exactly? So one can't actually automatically apply it to all the other kinds of new things. So now, if we're going to look at the future challenges, and I would like to say that there are various insights in three specific fields vis-a-vis the process of deterrence. How is it built? And it doesn't matter which player we're talking about, that effort for deterrence must start with an intel diagnosis of those strategic fears and values of the other side. Now, this diagnosis has to be carried out in a systematic manner and not intuitively. After we carry out the diagnosis with all the intuitions that we've learned from the other side, then we have to choose from our toolbox the thing that is most suitable for those fears that the other side feels, and not to choose the tool that is most available to us or most cutting edge from a technological point of view. In other words, again, we have to tailor-make it, as we said before, custom-make it for the actual adversary that we're talking about. Now, vis-a-vis the effectivity of this deterrence, one has to assume and prove that there is a causal relationship here. Very often we assume that there's a causal relationship rather automatically between our deterrence program and the behavior of the other side in the field. But I do not want to sound too naive and to say that one can create an algorithm or a mathematical mechanism that will actually show our effectiveness of our deterrence. But the intellectual effort that we're exerting once can actually narrow down the uncertainty, and the other time it might make our assumptions somewhat more humble about our success or failure in our deterrence, because the success in deterrence is actually very difficult to determine if we connect it to a failure. On a conceptual level, it seems that Israel, like other countries around the world, sometimes goes through that climax moment of deterrence. And that climactic moment of deterrence means that after every additional threat or use of force, it has the opposite sort of result than we wanted. For example, all sorts of threats that pushes people into a corner and they feel that they've got nothing to lose, and then they give a preemptive step. Or, for example, if we're in the framework of the conflict, it could be one blow too many that we use. In other words, instead of actually trying to shrink their sort of use of force, Instead of that, they make the other side escalate what they wanted to do. A second issue of deterrence can be very complex because this idea is actually in opposition, in contrast to the continuity of the art of deterrence, and that perhaps happens because we don't determine the point that we stop in advance. We don't know when we're going to actually reach that climax of deterrence, or when we do determine it and decide upon it in advance, it's very possible that during the actual fighting itself, it's very difficult to understand and analyze exactly where we are relative to that point. And I don't want to sound too naive and to say that one can calculate it mathematically, but I do believe that our strategic function and effectiveness could possibly increase if we organize our thoughts in such a way and our strategic conduct around that assumption of where that point, of climactic point of deterrence actually is. And now vis-à-vis the issue, the functional issue. Brigadier General Deckel spoke about a lack of the function that synchronizes national security issues, and I suggest there is room to think about another synchronizing point in the deterrence efforts, but in all the entities that do exist in the State of Israel, and not only the military ones, it's much more widespread. For example, at the moment, we don't have such a function that synchronizes before all these efforts to deter, who is responsible for conceptually and administratively accompanying our deterrence program, its substantiate, and the levels of its effectivity. Not only could this decrease its effectivity in the field of deterrence, but it could actually send rather opposing signals, if they're not synchronized, to the other side, to the adversary, or even misconceptions that we could be led to because of certain things that we take and that we want to prevent, in fact. I would just like to complete by saying that we now find ourselves in a very unique historical moment wherein this decisive moment is actually decreasing while the of strategic thought. Now, but when we think about the deterrence, we're using the old systems and way of thinking, and we ought to innovate certain issues and think about our functioning vis-à-vis deterrence. And that is what I was trying to do, is to propose various kinds of directions of thought. So once again, thank you very much for this.